Hi everyone, welcome back to the 21 and Sensory podcast with me, Emily. On today's show, I have the lovely Lydia Wilkins. Some of you might know Lydia, she's been on my podcast before, and you'll know maybe that I illustrated her cookbook, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But if you don't know, Lydia is a freelance qualified journalist with bylines in The Independent, Reader's Digest, The Metro, Refinery 29, and many more. And yeah, me and Lydia have known each other for a while, and we have been, I would say, collaborating on her amazing cookbook, which is coming out. Do you want to say the date of it, Lydia, and say hello? I feel like you ought to say it.
I was going to say thank you for such a lovely introduction. I mean, I'm impressed that you've managed to remember the titles of where I've written for, just simply on the basis that a lot of those that I don't really remember, in the sense that even if it was just like 2 years ago. So the cookbook is called the Autism Friendly Cookbook. This is out on the 21st November.
Exciting. So I will be putting so many links in the show notes of all the places you can pre-order it, and please go buy the book, everyone. Yeah, so it has over 100 recipes, am I right? Or is it 100 dead on?
It has 100 recipes dead on.
No.
30 of those are from other autistic individuals, including your lovely self.
Mm-hmm.
It's in terms of, sometimes people ask me in terms of whether I want to expand the book. Even though it's not come out yet, in the sense of always looking to the future. It's there's been conversations around that, people sort of asking me about that. If Jessica Kingsley thought that there was demand for it, I would put more than 100 in for the for a second version. Um, it's to the point where I actually have on my notes app, I have a list of recipes in case of this.
Okay. Very prepared. I like that.
It's just in the sense of writing this the first time round, I was actually struggling with generating recipe ideas,
Mhm.
enough so that it was actually becoming quite stressful in the sense of having enough variation. Um, at the beginning, when I had written the breakfast chapter, there was a lot around toast, for example. You cannot just have toast in a cookbook.
I understand, right.
You need something else more than just that. So it's
Mhm.
just in case, simply because, in the sense of, otherwise my brain will be panicking about this in however long. I actually do have a list of quite exotic options, I think.
Okay, nice. Exciting. And if I was going to ask you, this is a big question, but why should people buy the book? I obviously want them to buy it as much as you do because I was involved in it. But what would you say to someone who, maybe doesn't know you, know your work? Like, what's the selling points of this book?
Oh wow, okay. Nobody's actually asked me this before. I will just say
Oh.
I'm the worst for selling my work. I just
Mhm.
leave this up to other people.
Mhm.
Um, I think you should buy this cookbook because, always a good way to start off a conversation. I think you should buy the book because accessibility in the kitchen for autistic individuals has, it's crucial. However, it's not really been looked at before. So when it comes to the topic of independence and independent living, if you were just to talk to an autistic person of whatever ability, you would probably find that they were not educated, or it was just assumed that they would forever be living at home, or very often there was the stereotype of, you'll just be on benefits for all of your life. It was never, the skill set was just sort of, it's a part in the education curriculum in the UK, for example, but it's not sort of widely implemented. When it comes to consequences and the impact and all that kind of thing, if you look at the statistics, for example, about food bank use, disability is how am I going to phrase this? generally speaking, food bank users are more likely to be a food bank user if you have a disability, and there is statistical research to back that up. Autism under the Equality Act is actually counted as a disability. However, when this book basically came about, but in the sense of I'm struggling with a personal independence payment issue.
Mhm.
I ended up going to tribunal over the claim. But when I spoke professionally and to friends of mine and all that sort of thing, they were always saying that the access in terms of the access to the food was the issue, and they also didn't know how to articulate. Um, they did that in when they had issues with food, such
Mhm.
as in terms of sensory issues, they did not have the vocabulary. We have this idea that people who do not eat the same as us in terms of arbitrary expectations, that they're just picky, and very often we punish children for that. I know, for example, Emily, you actually talked on my podcast to me about this in the sense of
Mhm.
you had cereal. I think it was you had cereal for lunch, and one of your co-workers thought it appropriate to say, "But that's a breakfast cereal, and you shouldn't be eating that at lunchtime. It's none of their business,"
Yep.
and it's completely arbitrary.
Mhm.
But in the sense of if somebody had a sensory issue, um, very often the guidance for parents, guardians, carers, teachers, it's just not there.
Mhm.
During the lockdowns, I was teaching parents about this over Zoom as part of a project that I'm not going to name. But when I had spoken to the parents about the very basic strategy about how to change an issue, lest it sort of, snowball. It was one of those wonderful moments where they were like, "Oh my god, nobody's ever told me about this." It was just something simple, like if you had a carrot, for example, an autistic person might not like the crunch of it, for example, and you could just, serve it in a different format.
Mhm.
Why is that such an issue? And yet they were often punished for not accepting the food in that particular format. Um,
Mhm.
there's also this is another reason why um I'm sorry to it's this is a really long-winded answer.
No, go for
Um
it.
when it comes to things like eating disorders, and I will say from this point onwards there's a content warning.
Okay.
Um in terms of the research, it's becoming more and more clear from a journalistic viewpoint. This sort of struck me. It was becoming more clear, and research was suggesting that when it comes to people who present as female, they very often have an eating disorder, but if you actually look at them clinically, underneath all of that, they are not a diagnosed autistic person. There is a sensory issue there that may have become exacerbated and have manifested in an eating disorder, and yet that's not really been addressed. I think that just in the way we need to start having conversations about these issues. I'm not
Mhm.
saying my book is going to change any of this, um, but it's a really quite basic thing, really. I think it's statistically an autistic person is something like 1 in 50 people now.
Mhm.
That's a lot of a population. If you took like the whole of the UK, 1 in 50 people is an autistic person. That's a huge representation of the population.
Mhm.
We all know somebody who's autistic just by that metric. So why aren't we looking at that? That is the premise of why I wrote this book.
Nice. That was a very thorough answer, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about, what led you to write the book, and how you feel about, how important it is to have these conversations. And yeah, I think a lot of people also don't consider that it is how, the format or the presentation of the food can have a real like impact on
I think that's
someone's diet even.
yeah. It sort of this is so funny. It's I last night I was tagged in a Twitter exchange. This is relevant, I promise. I think that's potentially an example of the double empathy problem. In the sense of if you have a neurotypical parent, they might not necessarily think in such a way to sort of try and understand their autistic child. Um, they and may just view them as being like, stubborn. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying in the sense of I can sort of understand because they've not been given the tool as a parent to try and understand that.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of to pick up on what you were saying, in terms of why I wrote this book, this is this is sort of funny to me. I never really intended to write a book. It kind of just happened.
Mhm.
um, it's between the first and second lockdown, I think this was. I was made aware that I was eligible for personal independence payment, which is a type of disability benefit in the UK. It's not to do with work, and I want to say this loudly because so many people do not understand that. It's not means tested.
Mhm.
Um, I should have made a bet, frankly, in the sense of in terms of how I experience being autistic, because of the fact that I can talk to you fluently, but it doesn't make me less autistic. It just means that sometimes that I may present as a neurotypical person. Autism does not have a look.
Mhm.
You don't see the hours of preparation. You don't see my sensory issues. You don't. It's not visible.
Mhm.
I ended up going to a tribunal in the end, which was frankly one of the most degrading experiences I have ever had. But this was what was striking was the fact that in the report that had come back from the Department of Work and Pensions that had assessed me, and I'll never forget this, the person who had done such an assessment he had said he was an expert in autism in females, I think it was.
Mhm.
So to put, if you're describing women as females, women and girls as females, that's a really big, quite red flag there. The amount of stereotypes in the report was it was just bananas, frankly. Added to that, he had written this thing where apparently I could just learn to cook. If I can just learn, then by that definition, I can just learn to be normal. It's just
Mm.
I have the spiky profile, which means that in the set, I'm only really good at one particular thing. All of my other skills are quite abysmally not as good. Um, I can't just learn, and added to that, in terms of how I learn, it would take hours and hours. I also have sensory issues that build into this. My interoception is terrible. I can't always tell when I'm hungry in the sense of I need food.
Mhm.
I always keep, even as I'm talking to you, Emily, I actually have a cup filled with Coke as a drink, just as a visual prompt, because my interception is that bad.
Mhm.
And yet all that particular detail was just sort of written out because, of course, the DWP does not tell the truth.
Mhm.
Um, so in the end, I got the DWP. The benefit was paid to me, and the back payment was quite sizable because they were just frankly idiots. But it was really quite striking, and I remember talking to many different people, and they all came back with the same sort of experience, saying that the access in the kitchen was not feasible. They didn't know how the the amount of people that don't know, for example, about weighted cutlery, or to have a meal separator, or to have a jar opener, that's really quite interesting in that it needs a resource. Um, Virtually so many people didn't know about interception, they didn't know about proprioception, they didn't know like about sensory issues. There was just
Mhm.
so much information that was just missing. I thought it was standard in the sense of, after you're diagnosed, you go away, you're taught about this almost. I'm just very lucky in the sense that I had relatively good support. Um, so added to that, so what in the kind of really quite extraordinary sort of train of events, I guess. So at the time, my mentor had also died fairly soon after the DWP report had come in. Um, and this is the thing, he was a lovely man, and the last conversation we had was actually about another book that I was in conversation to write. I will never do that book, but it was just so utterly extraordinary because he had rung me up, which he would virtually never do. It was always the other way round. Um, he was so utterly excited by this, it was like a kid in a sweet shop. So this 90-something-year-old man was sort of talking down the phone in quite a rapid tone of voice, going, "This is how you should interview him, and this is how you get the subject, and this is how you write it, and this is how you do that, and I can't wait to see the book," and all that sort of thing. And I
Mhm.
remember the last thing he said to me was, "If you ever sign a contract for this book, send it to me," in the sense of a contract being vetted by him. He used to be the president of, I think it was Penguin Random House not so long ago.
Mhm.
um so in the sense of, it was just these sort of, the two sort of events sort of collided really quite nicely together in a way. Um, I would not have done that if somebody had not taken me aside and said, "You," like in the sense of having faith. That's
Mhm.
really quite powerful, I think. Which is why in the dedication of the book, and there's an illustration at the back to this particular individual. Just because it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it's a resource. I always viewed book writing as what proper journalists do. I never sort of envisioned myself doing that. So it is really quite strange after 2 and a bit years to be sat here with a copy of it in my hands.
Yeah, it must be really weird. And are you excited to kind of like see it physically places as well in terms of like bookshops?
I haven't really thought about that.
Because that they'll be there.
It is really quite weird to see that. Yeah, I don't know how to feel about that really. It's sort of like, as I said, I just sort of thought that my mum and maybe my grandparents would read it.
Mhm.
I didn't think so. Prior to recording, I was telling you about this. Um, it was really quite strange. I was at a conference fairly recently, and there were people who were coming up to me who recognised me from my Twitter picture, and told that my hair is too distinctive for this reason. Um,
Great.
and they were, they were saying such wonderful things, going, "I've ordered your book. You've written this, haven't you? I'm so excited." Which is just like, okay,
Oh.
this is so weird. Like, thank you. This is absolutely lovely for you to say. I hope it, like, lives up to your expectations.
Mhm.
it's, uh, it's just, it's slightly strange in the sense of, usually I just, if I just write for a website, I just write for the website. There isn't a
Mhm.
lot of engagement with it. I don't know who's reading it. And very often people will rarely say to me, "Oh, I read this piece that you did," or "I saw you had done that," type thing. There's not
Mhm.
a lot of engagement, so it has been quite a very new experience in the sense of people coming up to me, or people who contact me and they go, "I've ordered this. I've pre-ordered it." It's very strange, but also really nice.
I bet. It's really exciting. And is there I'd be interested to know, is there of the 100 recipes and the ones that you put in, because I want to know what your favorite recipe in the book is, but I realize there's 100 recipes and they're written by such a range of people. So, you can't be biased. So what I'm thinking is, what is your favorite recipe from the ones that you put in?
Ah, this changes whenever I've been asked this question. It's also the thing about this is I stopped writing this in January and it's nearly November, so
Yeah.
it's actually quite hard to remember what's in the book.
Mhm.
I may have spent nearly a year writing it, but that sort of I actually don't remember a lot of what's in the content.
Mhm.
um, Actually, while we're recording, I actually have a copy of it here. I'm going to look at the contents page to remind me.
Go
Um,
for it. Reference the book. I like that.
just because, can I choose one from each chapter?
Sure, why not?
Um, this changes every time I've been asked this question. So, um, when there's a magazine that interviewed me that'll be out in December that will have a totally different answer to this.
Oh, will it?
Yeah, it will do. So from the breakfast recipes, there's a what's called strawberry paradise smoothie. And that's sort of, you know, when you've had a meltdown or things are just like frankly a bit, rubbish, and you sort of need
Mhm.
something to pick you back up. Strawberry smoothie is the one thing I would always go for. Um, it's this is really specific, and I will caveat this. This is this is such a safe food type thing. Do you know Boost smoothies? The
I don't
chain. It's
know.
That was always a chain that my sister and I would go to whenever we went shopping with my mum.
Mhm.
So we started doing that when I was maybe about 8 or 9, and we still do that. But each time we've always we've always stopped at a Boost smoothie shop, and I've always had the strawberry smoothie order.
Okay.
Like, it's not changed since I've done that in nearly, what, 20 years now?
Mhm.
From the lunch recipes, I just trying to decide because there's so many on this that I really quite like. So from the lunch recipes, it would be a toss up between Soho halloumi fries and salad and the naan hut chicken wrap. Um, Soho is a place that I absolutely love up in London. It feels like a second home from home almost. Um,
Mhm.
it's When I first started practicing as a journalist, there was a woman who invited me to a party at the Groucho. Um, and subsequently, on other occasions, I'd go and see her and other people at the Groucho, where you need to membership to get past the door. Um,
Mhm.
I remember interviewing her as a student, and this is something you should not do. You should always pay for your own things, lest it's buying influence.
Mhm.
So she treated me to a meal at the Groucho kitchen downstairs, where it had the most lovely halloumi fries.
Ooh.
I will never forget that. That being said, you should always pay for your own stuff. She paid for the meal. Not the Naan Hut chicken wrap is based on a place in Brighton. It's a actual shop. This.
Mhm.
So when I was a student, we we actually studied just across the road from the place in Brighton, from Nanha, and they used to do these massive wraps where you could get it for about £4, I think, but they were just absolutely giant. And they were so it was breaded. I think it was breaded chicken, chili sauce, just completely smothering it, and a lot of salad. It's
Okay.
just absolutely wonderful. Particularly if you're hungry on a Saturday. A few of the other students would come in, like, hungover, having been reporting the previous evening,
Mhm.
and it was just absolutely wonderful. Um, for dinner, I'm just trying to think.
Mhm.
For the dinner recipes, I'm quite a fan of quesadillas. Though that's my mother's recipe. Sort of
Mhm.
pinched it and put it in the book.
Nice.
Um, it's And dessert recipe. I'm sorry, I'm getting reacquainted with my book as I'm talking.
Excellent.
Um, for the dessert section, there is a sponge cake recipe that's named after my great grandmother. So she actually died while I was writing this. She died just over a year ago. But she was, those sort of people you meet where they're sort of like they're just completely original,
Mhm.
and just sort of iconic in that way. She really was. But she would always catch you slightly off guard with this sort of the humorous remarks that she used to make. So there was, and I've written about this in the book. There was I think it was maybe a year prior to the pandemic. She was in hospital. I forget what for. But she was quite significantly ill. At this time, she was in her 90s. Um,
Okay.
and much to my amusement, she was behaving like a petulant child while in hospital. So we're trying to encourage her to eat the hospital food. And she had done this sort of thing where she was complaining about the cup of tea was always cold because the particular ward was not allowed boiling water because it could be a risk to elderly patients in the sense of
Okay.
burning themselves. Um, so they had this. kind of like a chocolate mousse pudding type thing in a disposable cup type thing.
Mhm.
I'm not entirely sure what you call this. And we're trying to encourage her to eat it. Um, and she did this. She was it like she had her bottom lip out like a child would do to show her disapproval. And we're doing the whole sort of, oh, don't worry, it will taste like Maltesers. They're your favourite, trying to coax her. So she did the wonderful thing where she opened it, she took a tiny bit on a massive spoon, stuck it in her mouth, and because she was quite deaf and her hearing aid wasn't particularly working, so at the time she was being extra loud.
Mhm.
So she loudly pronounced, and the entire ward, am I allowed to swear on this?
You can. You are allowed.
To the entire ward, she pronounced that, quote, tastes like shit.
Okay, amazing.
I just remember my sister and I were just we were in tears of laughter at this, because this was from the woman who was like, always trying to uphold standards type thing, but she was just
Mhm.
absolutely terrible. She was notorious for things like that. So it's in the I sort of the two things I associate with her, to bring this back to the
Mhm.
question, the two things I associate with her are Maltesers, as those were her favourite treat.
Mhm.
We used to smuggle those into the care home at Christmas time for her.
Amazing.
And also the smell of lavender. So in the I don't know what it was. It wasn't perfume and it wasn't in the derogatory sense, but she always smelled really lovely in the sense of lavender. So
Mhm.
I think she may have even had like something where she kept her clothes to scent her clothing, maybe? I don't know. Um
Okay.
so there is a sponge cake where I sort of combine the two flavours in that sense. She was absolutely terrible for things like cake, and always sort of like you could always see like her eyes would light up wherever like a cake would be brought out. It's like, yes, please bring that here type thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those would be my favourites, I think.
Okay.
Um,
That is interesting, yeah.
that would change between now and whenever like somebody asks me again.
Yeah. I understand that. That's, more than understandable because I feel like even when you're trying to pick out a recipe, you might fancy something one day and then not fancy it the next day. So I totally understand.
It is. It's definitely a mood thing, and it's also in the sense of sort of some of the recipes were actually quite sort of difficult to write.
Mhm.
So in the sense of this doesn't have photographs, which is why you illustrated this.
Mhm.
Um, but in the sense of writing for individuals who may not necessarily know about the kind of the logistics, in the sense of like say that you had to melt chocolate for a recipe, for example. You use the process of bain marie, where you have the um where you have a bowl over the boiling water in a saucepan.
Mhm.
Right, try writing that to describe it to someone who may not know what that is called. That's quite difficult to do. And sort of there were particular recipes where I was having to revise it and sort of go over and having other people read it in the sense of, does this make sense? It makes sense to me, but I've lost the objectivity to tell whether or not this would actually be useful to someone.
Right, okay.
Because, yeah, so there are some recipes that I will forever hate in that book just for that reason.
I see. I think that's fine though. Like there's always going to be like those sort of bits, isn't there?
There always will be. When it came to, I hated doing the edits for this.
Mhm.
I just, so the whole of January this year, the end of January was the deadline for turning in the manuscript. Um, and I think you will remember, Emily, sort of like I was sort of like terrorizing everyone in the sense of with getting this all together. Um, so it was at the end of January, no, for the whole of January, I had to go through all of the book to do
Mhm.
all of the kind of like the tidying up, so like, is the punctuation correct and all that sort of thing, is it formatted. We also had that wonderful sort of few stressful weeks, and I'm so sorry that I did this. I should have been more organized in the sense of pulling together all of the illustrations. added to that, interviewees had to sign different forms and things, which I also had to hand in, which was, yeah, I may have earned myself a few grey hairs after that. But it was also, I had to do, I think it was 2 rounds of further edits after it had been copy edited.
Mm-hmm.
By, I think it was the end of July was the last time I saw the book before it went off to print. By that time, I was just sort of like, bye, honey, I never want to see you again. Never. It's just, oh, yeah. So, in the sense of like, that it's just sort of this weird sort of bubble now, sort of looking to the future of what happens next type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know what that will be. I'm hoping for a second book. Who knows? Writing a cookbook's really sort of ironic, really. I am the world's worst cook. I mean, if it's not burnt or if it's not charred, you've earned the lottery, my friend, if you come over to my house for anything.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was just sort of, everyone needs a pandemic project in the sense of keeping themselves occupied.
Mm-hmm.
It was just sort of really ironic that this was mine.
Of all the lockdown projects, the fact that you wrote like an entire cookbook is pretty big.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. That was just sort of, I think the lockdown was sort of kind of like a catalyst in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Within the first sort of, so 2 days into the first lockdown, I turned 21, and by the end of that week, basically all of my freelance work had been basically derailed.
Okay.
It was one of those sort of like, oh fuck, like what happens now? Like everything has just sort of gone. Like, so wonderful. This is the way to start your 20s. This
Yeah.
it was just so weird. But in the sense of sort of like trying to pick up and sort of like trying to do something. If you're going to take inspiration from anywhere, attacking the DWP, I think, is a worthwhile cause.
Mm-hmm.
um, it's just a sort of, it's, I view this as having a dynamic disability. I'm not ever going to be not autistic, but
Yeah.
just it gets really exhausting having to just address the frankly really stupid ingrained attitude. um it just or in just in the sense of, oh, she can just learn, really. Maybe you can, I sort of wanted to write back saying, maybe you can just learn to not be a dick, like. It's
I just, I don't understand. Like, there's so many other ways of like putting things, but using the word learn like it's something that you haven't already, maybe actively tried or, haven't actively, thought about that you're not willing to learn how to cook. Whereas actually it's just you can't, safely cook or something like that.
there were so many things with this. There was, you can hear the cat. In the year writing and editing it, there was a lot of coincidences. So in the book, there is, the first part of the book is kind of the resource for parents, guardians, teachers, carers, that sort of thing. In trying to unpick and explain sensory issues, what interoception is, and sort of how to support us in the kitchen and all that kind of thing. What was really weird about that is, there used to be a charity that used to support me, they don't anymore. During the first lockdown, they were arranging classes for us over Zoom. There was a local business that had basically said they would teach us a really basic recipe, which I thought, fair enough. I'll have a look. I'm
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be writing this book. I could probably learn a few things. And this was really weird. So as I logged onto Zoom, it was a guy who had taught me at secondary school nearly a decade ago. He'd come in as a, what do you call it, like as a guest speaker.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and I remembered him because at the end of that particular session, I'd asked him for a copy of the recipe. It was Mexican themed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was just really quite weird. He did, much to my amusement, he didn't remember me. So I had to say that, and I had to do the whole thing. You know, when you say this is so weird, I remember you. You taught me at secondary school with, like, you know, it had such and such a detail. He has a smoothie bike, and I remember having a go on the smoothie bike. Um,
Mhm.
but I continued. I interviewed him for the book, and I actually started going down to a few of his classes. So he teaches kind of like how would I put this? There are classes for individuals in terms of so he specializes in kind of like additional needs and that kind of thing. Um he has a base in Lewis called Community Chef. I
Mhm.
started going to a few of the classes there to learn and to sort of like, you know, as research for the book. Around this time last year I was commuting once a week, and you know, I'd go and then come back with a, you know, like a giant loaf of chocolatey bread and all that kind of thing. Um,
Amazing.
it was just so weird in the sense of like this is someone that I've not seen for a decade, and
Mhm.
all of a sudden you've come across my Zoom screen. I couldn't remember Robin's name, so I didn't recognize it, but I knew the face. He's a lovely man. I've
Mhm.
and very patient. I'm very lucky that he's not you know, like cut off his help in that respect.
Mhm.
Um, he's absolutely wonderful. He is so interesting to talk to. Um, he's also been helpful on a few occasions, kind of outside of this. When he said that if ever I needed advice and all that kind of thing.
Mhm.
There was actually a messy work situation a few weeks ago. I still feel really bad about that, but he was absolutely wonderful in supporting that. I had to go and apologize to someone in Lewis. It wasn't my fault, but yeah. Um, but the point being, so it was just really quite weird and really quite spooky that happened. Added to that, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I will anyway. So Robin and I were photographed for BBC Good Food, as you know.
Mhm.
So we were in that issue last December. What was really quite strange was that so in January I opened up my Facebook account. I was procrastinating while editing this. Um,
Mhm.
I don't really use Facebook. I go on it maybe like once a month type thing. And
Yeah.
I had this message request, and this was from a woman who had taught me at primary school, so nearly 20 years ago.
Mhm.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, it's I remember her really well because she basically taught me, like, in the sense of she was the one who taught me to, you know, love to write and about history and all that sort of thing.
Mhm.
She was a huge influence, and it was just so strange because she had seen this as well. I hadn't seen her for 20 years. I hadn't spoken to her since I left where I'm originally from, which was a decade ago. Like, this was so weird. She taught me to full 2 decades ago, nearly, and she'd seen it as well. Like,
That's weird.
it was. It spooked me, but it was so nice. And in a few weeks, I'm very hopeful. She's potentially coming to my book launch.
Oh, that would be nice.
It's just this was so spooky, but just sort of like this is fate. This like I don't know what the universe holds in store.
Yeah, exactly.
It's completely ridiculous. I don't know how she found me. My Facebook account is on the highest privacy setting as well,
Mhm.
so I don't know how she did that. Um, but she is in the book as well, so it was really spooky that. But if I can say, it's been really quite nice. In the sense of so in terms of the setup, I had kind of like the majority control over how the text was executed and all that kind of thing. Um, so it was always important to have the majority of the individuals in this are disabled and or neurodiverse. That
Mhm.
was really important to do. Um, Simply because we are underrepresented everywhere else. I think we need to be making space for other individuals, and I wanted to do that, which
Mhm.
is why I said to the publisher, that's why I wanted you as the illustrator. um
Aw.
and added to that, I mean, it's I had actually been reading your work long before you and I had ever spoken.
Oh, really?
Yes. I even have them. I still have the weighted blanket you influenced me to get long before you and I had ever spoken.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's so even down to on the back of the book, there's a photo of me who is by a photographer. I absolutely love this woman. She's wonderful to work with. Her work is amazing. Um,
Oh, it's Shona, isn't it? I've
yeah,
seen her work, yeah.
it was important. So she photographed me. I think this was a week after I was out of quarantine. So at the beginning of April, I think.
Mhm.
But it was always important in the sense of wanting to. There are people who wouldn't have, like, if I'm writing this, then other people should at least benefit in some way from it. Um,
Mhm.
I'm just hopeful that like it sells like at least like what more than one copy. Um,
Yeah.
so it was always important to do that sort of thing. In terms of the amount of people, there's maybe just 6 people who are not disabled and or neurodiverse.
Mhm.
Um, Out of the interviewees, there's only one person who is outside of that. And that includes the individuals who work with, you know, the autistic individuals and all that kind of thing.
Mhm.
There's only one person who's not neurodiverse and who is not disabled. I think it's
Okay.
important we start doing this.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it is quite strange, very edifying, but also a little bit sort of like, holy hell, that happened.
Yeah. I can only imagine. And I want to chat a little bit about obviously you mentioned like there's going to be a book launch, and you've recently also launched the Haute Cuisine podcast. Would you like to explain a little bit about that and about the name as well? I find that very interesting.
The name I can't take credit for. That I basically put a shout out on Instagram asking for help with that.
Mhm.
I'm terrible when it comes to titles. I find in anything written or anything kind of in terms of design and that sort of thing, I'm terrible at coming up with names for things.
Mhm.
So there was a lovely journalist called Amy Barrett. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She is part of. It's a. I'm going to look this up. I know it's for the BBC, and I know it's to do with science, but I want to get the magazine name right.
Mhm.
Amy. She is a journalist for BBC Science Focus magazine. And I've interviewed her on a few occasions and all that sort of thing. And she put this name forward for the podcast.
Mhm.
Which it just though it's sort of wonderfully cheesy, but I really quite liked the pun in that.
Mhm.
um, so what had sort of occurred to me while writing this book, there were so many conversations that were being had that could not go into the book. Um, so people would tell me, I don't know, they would tell me about their experiences with things kind of outside their autistic diagnosis.
Mhm.
Um, which that's not really relevant to the book. It's in the sense that this is the Autism Friendly Cookbook. Um, but accessibility benefits everyone. So then
Mhm.
there needed to be some sort of space to put that sort of conversation. It just couldn't go in the book, and it was sort of reflected when this really took me by surprise. There's been a few chronically ill individuals who've ordered the book who are not autistic, and that's
Mhm.
because the recipes have the energy metric that you put in on in terms of the illustration for all the different recipes.
Mhm.
And when I started asking why, they said because that's accessible to us in the sense of that's the cost of the energy, so that's why we took the book on board, which is so lovely. But sort of like somebody really needs to do a recipe book for chronically ill individuals, frankly.
Yeah.
So there needed to be a space for that kind of conversation in the sense of accessibility benefits everyone. Um, so I started the podcast. still going on, and it will continue going on into the week that the book is published. Um, it's a one-off series, and it's basically to kind of curate sort of experiences of different individuals talking. So when I mentioned Robin, the guy who's down in Lewis just
Mhm.
now, he was on the first episode. He his business is a community interest company, and it started partly because he had been influenced when he had traveled to India and he had lived among different communities and had taught and educated individuals about food, and he had learnt a lot by living
Mhm.
among them. um and he coming back to the UK in 1994, I think it was, um, he expressed that he felt dissatisfied with Western food culture and he wanted to do something in terms of poverty levels and education, which is how he set up this group. So it's very low cost, or some of his classes are free to attend at times.
Mhm.
His story is just absolutely fascinating. He is going to get this right. He is a Jewish South African man who lives in the UK, um, who has set up a business within the food industry. In
Mhm.
his spare time, he also makes wooden instruments.
Okay.
Um, and he also has, in terms of his politics, his experiences, and all that kind of thing, he's really interesting to talk to. He's very much sort of, in terms of the philosophy, it's so interesting when he talks about kind of like how we as a society we need to have empathy for other people, not just people who are like us.
Mhm.
um we need to, rather than having performative empathy, like it needs to actually, actions rather than words type thing. um which is just, his story is just so utterly fascinating. I could talk to him for hours, and which was in the sense of taking along my mobile phone to just record this. It was just a wonderful excuse just to ask him questions.
Mhm.
He is the first episode. That's the sort of conversation that is on the podcast. We I also talk to people like Natasha Lipman. Natasha is, how am I going to put this? I guess I could call her like a partner in crime, though we've never met in the flesh. um,
Mhm.
I forget how we got in contact. It'll come back to me once I finish talking to you, I bet. Um, but she gave me a lovely quote for the back of the book. Um, we've spoken on panels. She interviewed me for her newsletter and that sort of thing. She has been utterly wonderful about the book. Um, we had a really interesting conversation about wellness and how wellness is not something for everyone, rather
Mhm.
than just sort of attacking this, I guess you could call it an industry. There needs to be some nuance about it. That was a fascinating conversation, rather than sort of like being quite black and white about it. Um, we also have some autistic individuals, including yourself, coming up on the podcast.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it was just a sort of way to put all the, there was just a collection really of stories that I couldn't do anything with, but they needed to be heard in some way. Um, that's available everywhere apart from Apple Podcasts, because I can't seem to make it work.
I see.
I have tried my best. I've asked everyone I know how to fix that, but just it's on virtually every other podcasting station apart from Apple Podcasts.
Oh, that's so weird.
Yep, I wish I knew how to work this. I really wish I knew. Um, it's like, when people are like, nobody understands the cloud.
Yeah.
Exactly like that. I don't understand what they're asking of me. I really wish I did, but
Mhm.
that's sort of like, it's too late now and it will not be available there because it's just sort of pointless trying.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's just sort of like, and it was sort of, this is kind of selfish to admit, but I saw that a lot of people who when people write a book, very often now they have a one-off spin-off podcast type thing.
Yeah.
Um So I thought, why don't I do one? Um, in the sense of sort of like, this is just basically satisfying my overwhelming nosiness, basically.
It's.
Um,
I think I honestly love podcasts, and you can probably tell that because I also do one. You do one. Like, I don't know. There's something kind of really interesting about podcasts because yeah, you are being nosy, but also you're telling someone's story. You're hearing someone else's point of view and their background and
it's quite
everything.
edifying, isn't it? The sort of like
Yeah.
it's quite satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you would call it, but in the sense of you are curating something that doesn't really have a lot of rules attached to it either. You can do pretty much anything on a podcast.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
it's really quite it's a departure from newspapers, but when it comes to reporting and all that sort of thing, there are a lot of different rules in
Mm-hmm.
what you can and can't follow. With podcasting, there really isn't anything. You just need to be careful about advertising and not like, saying things that, give out disinformation or fake
Yeah.
news.
Yeah.
Though the definition of which is debatable, of course. But there is something quite edifying in that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny you've commented on that. There will be something very exciting that we're doing with Conscious Being very soon that I'm very excited about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we just had a conversation earlier today.
Ooh, exciting. The last thing I was gonna get you to chat about is the stuff that you have just done, the prints that you've just done with
ah,
this thing they call recovery.
the collaboration with Jenny from this thing called Recovery, that sort of began in the sense of I was being really nosy and asking questions. Um, Jenny was someone that I had really admired in the. I don't know if anyone. I think you had one of these, possibly. At the beginning of the pandemic, I had a paper gang subscription, and one
Oh, okay.
one of the boxes was her.
Oh, okay.
You know when they do like so they had the box and it every month would be a different theme and it would be a different illustrator.
Mhm,
I still had the washi tape with her design on it. Um but I had always sort of I had collected her designs and had admired her and that sort of thing. Her account followed my Instagram page, which was so interesting. And it was basically because she had found my book, which is like,
ah,
okay, this is interesting. This, um, so I put it to her in the sense of chronically ill individuals had taken up the book in some way, which was really nice. And I wanted to do something just for them in the
mhm,
sense of a resource or like, something tangible. Um, so we had a chat on Zoom. We initially started off with the idea of having a pin badge. Maybe we were kicking around ideas of like, the term spoonie and all that kind of thing. Um, we switched to prints for a number of reasons.
mhm,
The idea was sort of to have an affirmative resource. So very often when I had interviewed people, even if you just talk to others, not necessarily autistic individuals, like other disabled people,
mhm,
there's so many kind of like expectations within food culture that we really should be starting to unpack rather than just sort of setting arbitrary expectations. Um, so rather than just sort of like you're a failure because you've had pre-prepared food and all that sort of thing, it wasn't that long ago that I had been listening to a quite popular millennial podcast, um, and one of the hosts had made this suggestion that they had seen pre-chopped carrots available in their supermarket, and they were saying that, well, that's so privileged and that's so, why on earth would you need that, it's a waste of plastic and all that sort of thing. Well, if you have limb difference, for example, you need someone to chop it up for you. It's not privilege, that's just being disabled. Like, it was just so stupid, that particular comment. But that is such an ingrained attitude, and it really needs to be dealt with. Um, and it also in the sense of people internalize a lot of that, and it's really quite, it's difficult to unpick and it's difficult to unlearn. Um, So Jenny and I were talking kind of like about our collective experiences. Jenny has just been diagnosed as autistic, and she's put this
Mhm.
on her Instagram page. Um, so we came up with the idea of doing 4 different prints. So one of them has the term, what was it? One of them has a phrase on it that is to do with unpack your arbitrary expectations.
Yeah.
Which was the one I put forward, just because in the sense of so very often, um, it's quite annoying when people feel it's okay to comment on your food, for example, or to impose their expectations upon you when they don't know your support needs. Um,
Mhm.
Examples such as when you told me about the your work colleague who said you shouldn't be eating cereal at lunchtime. It's none of their business.
Yeah. I agree.
Um, and it's also when we very often we use the term picky. Picky is such a highly gendered, quite disgusting word, and I think in some circumstances we should ban the term picky.
Mhm.
It unnecessarily penalises people very often because their support needs have not been understood. Um, so there is another print, for example, where it says that preferences are not being picky. I think it's rather than just sort of in terms of disability models when it comes to being autistic, for example, we are so often penalised as being picky when it comes to sensory issues. Why can't we normalise them just a bit in the sense of, like, they're not to be ashamed of?
Mhm.
Um, it's very often talked when it comes to the medical model of disability, it's so very often talked about as if it's something shameful. It's not, it's just a part of us. We are human beings. This is just to illustrate, just in the sense of, I feel quite impassioned by this. At the beginning of April, friends of mine had gone out to a place in London. I had been in quarantine and my birthday coincided with this, so they took me out a week later. Um, and towards the end of the evening, there was another person who was a bit late and they turned up. And an issue arose in the sense of whether or not we were all hungry and what we would like to eat. The menu that was on offer was, first of all, obnoxiously expensive. It was like stupidly too much. Added to that, it was sort of quite restrictive in the sense that it was sort of like, um it was food that was not inclusive, and it was very much sort of like, kind of like cold meat and a lot of fish and all that sort of thing. Um, so there was one option on the
Mhm.
menu, and I was in the sense of sort of like, I don't eat a lot of meat. Previously, I was a pescatarian. Um,
Mhm.
but in the sense of if I'm hungry enough and I know that I need to eat, in the sense of, feeling faint, I will eat meat. I
Mhm.
I don't eat a lot of it. I don't very rarely buy meat as well. So I was being mocked by, it felt like it was, I actually felt quite embarrassed, to be honest, just because it was a sensory issue, and even though I was sort of put in the position where I had to flag up saying that this is just me being autistic, like it's not wrong. I don't know why this is so funny. Like I feel like I've missed a joke, and I sort of like, I felt like I wanted to disappear in the sense of like, you're mocking me because you think it's funny. It's not,
Mhm.
and that's just your arbitrary expectations. Like who I sort of like wanted to confront this, but I was too embarrassed, and I was also still sick from being in quarantine. Like it was really not a good evening that. But just in the sense of like, preferences are not picky. Preferences are just preferences when it comes to sensory issues. That needs to be normalized rather than trying to correct this all the time. Um, when it comes to things like uh, harmful therapies, for example, why do we need to correct something if somebody's healthy? if they're eating, they're still getting the nutrition and all that sort of thing. Why do we need to correct them to meet an arbitrary standard? We don't.
Yeah, that's very true.
Autistic people are just humans. Like, leave us alone and just why can't we just be allowed to exist?
Hmm.
I don't understand that. In it, while writing and researching this, that came up a lot. There was so um I ended up looking at a lot of content where it was saying things like, eat this food to cure your autism. What?
Yes.
Just first of all, that's not scientifically possible. Second of all, why on earth would you want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's so that sort of thing is so sort of I saw a tweet from, I think it was Frances Ryan from The Guardian the other day, where there's at the time of recording there's the clip going round of Michael J. Fox reuniting with his castmate from Back to the Future. Um
Hmm.
and the replies to the video on Twitter were people saying, "Oh, it's so tragic that he's disabled." Um, in the sense of going, "That's so sad." And Francis Ryan pointed out, they're saying, "That's so utterly entitled, and that's on you. That's a reflection of you, in the sense of you've made it all about yourself."
Hmm.
That why is it that in the sense of that's being co-opted as well? He is brilliant. He has done so much for Parkinson's and all that sort of thing. But the same sort of logic applies when it comes to, food and that kind of thing. Why would you want to cure us? Because that's just a reflection on you, really, in the sense of you think we're such a tragedy. Why don't you come into our universe first? It's quite a rich place, this. It will
Hmm.
leave you better off. We're quite, I'm not being funny, but we're actually, human beings as well. We have thoughts, we have feelings, we have a life.
Yeah.
It's why can't you see us as a human being and just sort of like, yeah, um that's the sort of really what I wanted to do, really, in the end of all this. We are just at the very basic, we are all human beings. I mean, we just need to have a conversation about like what we should and should not be doing when it comes to food.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think, yeah, there's so many. I feel like we could talk about this forever. There's so many different things that we could go like down into and stuff,
Mm,
like you saying about, you know, people thinking that, autism could be affected by what you eat and stuff like that. And it's madness. But, um, you know, those people are always going to be out there and
of
they're always going to
course,
be.
they obviously individuals have a right to have an opinion. However, you do not have the right to start inhabiting this particular space. You
Mm,
also don't have the right to, for example, be influencing our healthcare with science that has been debunked on several occasions.
hmm.
That's the bit I find objectionable, and I think it's important that we put such a caveat in.
Yeah, yeah.
We need to be listened to far more rather than sort of this infantilizing sort of like, oh, she's just picky because she is just, spoiled type thing.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I agree.
Just we could talk, as you said, we could talk.
Yeah, literally. Um, I realised that we've been chatting for over an hour, and it's gone really quickly. Where can people buy your book? We should have mentioned this earlier, but we're going to mention it now.
Well, you can buy my book from pretty much anywhere. So this is available for pre-order on Amazon.
Hmm.
Amazon is the place to get it if you're outside the US and outside the UK. If
Hmm.
you're in the US, the place to go is to Barnes and Noble. In the UK, this is available from pretty much anywhere. So this is on Waterstones, Foyles, WH Smith. It's on Bookshop. Um, it's also available direct from the publisher. Um, yeah, it's it's available in different places. If you can't have access to that, so in the sense of if you are in somewhere like the Netherlands, for example, you can go to your local bookshop and ask them to pre-order it. Um, and the bookshop owner will do that. I would just say as well, just because I've been asked about this recently, if you would like it translated, contact my publisher because they are
Mhm.
always interested in doing that. It was just so it was so funny. There was a few individuals who were writing messages to me on Instagram in Dutch. Um, I've been trying to teach myself the language on and off for a while now. The Netherlands feels like a second home to me. But they were asking whether this would be available in Dutch. If there's demand for it, if you want it to come to the Netherlands, you can ask the publisher for that to happen.
Mhm.
Yeah. So this will be available pretty much anywhere. It's also on I don't know what you call it. You know when you download a book onto your Kindle?
Oh, like an ebook.
Yeah, what's the
Um, what is it? Like the Kindle store, like the App Store
It's
on
been
a
a while
Kindle?
since I bought a Kindle book. I'm not
Yeah,
entirely sure what it's called. Let's call it the Kindle store for now.
sure. Why not? I think people know what you mean. It's all good.
Get your books from the Kindle store, children. There will be, and I should mention this as well. So if you listen to my podcast, if you would like some money off your pre-order, there is a code in the show notes.
Ooh. Okay. Give me that link. Well, as in just a link to your podcast, or there's a link specifically?
On all of the episodes, I've put it in all of the show notes so far.
Oh,
You can get 20% off if you order from my publisher directly.
amazing. Okay, cool. I will reference that as well in the show notes.
It just
Exciting.
This just sounds so awkward saying this. I am the worst for selling any of my work.
I'll sell it on behalf of you. Guys, go get her book.
Right, Emily's my publicist, everyone. She's on the payroll. Um,
All inquiries towards me. I will sell your book for you.
oh my god, it's sort of like 21 and Sensory Inquiries Ltd.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's ready for pre-order. It's been quite scary this week because there have been people who have contacted me privately who've already got their copy. Um, It's basically been
Oh,
it's been printed and it's basically just sitting in warehouses waiting to be dispatched.
okay.
So people are already starting to get their copies. But it's out officially on November 21st. So at the time of recording, there is a month to go. Quite scary, this.
Exciting.
I think everyone else is far more excited than I am, but very
I think once it's out in the world, though, I think you will, like, you almost have to get past that to process it, if that makes sense.
bit daunting. This.
Yeah.
That that being said, I'm hopeful that there is a second book in the works. But we will talk about that another time, perhaps.
Hmm.
Lovely to talk to you as always.
Yeah, likewise.